Good morning, everyone. Welcome for this exclusive interview with France 24 RFI on the occasion of the Peace Forum, an international event on world governance and multilateralism, which takes place every year in Paris. We're glad to host in our studios Jean-Noël Barrot, the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France, appointed by Michel Barnier.
Bienvenue, Monsieur le Ministre.
Good morning,
Good morning.
You were part of the previous government. You were Minister Delegate to Digital Transition. You are head of the French diplomacy, and you started out by going to Lebanon, Ukraine, and Israel last week. On this, you went to Israel. There was a diplomatic incident when the Israeli police went to enter the French national area. You mentioned that to your ministry. Do we stick to this, or do we move on?
The situation is unacceptable, and that is why I chose to call the ambassador to speak with the ambassador. And when you summon an ambassador to meet with them, it's the first thing you can do. It's a way of showing that France will not stand by and will not tolerate Israeli forces entering these areas which are under our protection. And is our way of reiterating quite firmly that we will not allow things happen ever again.
Or those forces of the army to come without being authorized.
Exactly right.
You mentioned the first degree. What is the second degree? After convoking the ambassador, what happens now?
Well, as I just said, in diplomatic language, in parlance, there are certain levels of sanctions. We feel that this was a very serious event, so therefore I implemented the top-level sanction. It is a clear message to say that France will not stand by if ever this were to happen again, and we maintain all options open.
But you don't expect anything from what the ambassador could say.
This is a sanction. This is a sanction to say that this will never happen again, and there are certain diplomatic sanctions in place, and we've implemented the top-level one.
The Minister for Finances is coming tomorrow. We know that there are calls for ceasefire and against the settlements in Jordan. What can France do against supremacists?
Well, what is clear is that we clearly stand up against the policy that is being put forward by the Israeli minister, who is going to say that we need to push forward with illegal activities, colonization and forced colonization of the West Bank. And we are taking action, and what they have done is they have targeted a number of extremists who were encouraged by Netanyahu's government. And at the European level, we have created a set of sanctions that are targeting any company or person who are guilty of this form of colonization. We've already implemented 2 sanctions as part of this round of sanctions. And we're currently working on a 3rd round at a European level.
Very soon, when Mr. Smotrich will come, he's not invited by France. He's invited by Israeli forever. That doesn't raise any issues, this gala being
so far,
organized.
I have no confirmation that he will be coming to France.
Quelque chose qui évidemment marque beaucoup l'actualité internationale, à savoir la victoire aux États-Unis de Donald Trump.
There's another major international event, the election of Trump. Macron was one of the first to congratulate him. At the end of the day, deep within yourself, do you tend to believe that this is not going to be very convenient?
Well, that's not really the issue, because the American people have chosen. It is their right to choose. For 150 years, we have been working closely with the United States, and this is the 59th American presidential presidential election. So we will be waiting, obviously, for the 60th elections to come through as well. And for many years, or at least for the past 7 years, we have been preparing for this changing world. And right back in 2017, when the French president made his speech at the Sorbonne, said that Europe needs to take on full means for its own sovereignty.
Europe was not really prepared.
No, I think that Europe is much better prepared than it was back in 2017 for a Trump presidency because of all the crises that we've been through. COVID, the war in Ukraine. These crises have consolidated and reinforced our sense of European solidarity and given us the bravery to push forward the agenda that France initially drafted. And obviously, our European partners, they have embraced it as well. But this is an agenda that we can now accelerate in terms of security, in terms of democracy, and many other topics. These are topics that we were working on back in 2017, and we have started to make solid headway. We now just need to ramp up.
You know that the US is the first client of the EU in terms of trade, the first to host exports. They're going to set up new taxes, custom taxes, at least 10%, maybe even more. Can we withstand that shock of a trade war? Can we respond?
Well, you're right in saying that the European Union is the leading trade partner for the United States of America. And that is why for the United States, if they were to implement customs duties en masse against Europe, that would be an awful mistake because it would heavily penalize American companies that are based in France and in Europe. And it would completely cut off the American middle class from a large portion of their purchasing power because they too buy products coming out of Europe. So if the Trump administration were to commit this grave mistake, then we would see there is going to be a huge impact on all of our agricultural and farming products as well.
What about Germany?
Well, we were speaking earlier of the first term of the Trump administration. Back then, we were still believers of the free trade dogma. We said that in Europe we need to have the power to sanction or to respond to an unfair trade balance. But Europe has changed. Just last month, Europe, on its own right, decided to implement levies and duties on Chinese electric vehicles. So that is because China brought in its own taxes, which were going to penalize our companies.
You said it exists. Will Europe do that again if Trump persists in pushing on this?
Well, Europe has started by opening up negotiations with the new administration, or when the new administration comes in, because everyone is a loser in a trade war. So if these new customs are going to be, duties are going to be brought in, then we will respond.
France is in favor of that.
Well, yes.
Another major worry for Europeans and Frenchmen is to know whether the Trump administration will abandon Ukraine. Will Europe be able to take up the slack? Europeans buy up a lot of weapons to send it to Ukraine, and they're quite divided to make up for the lack of American aid, having to borrow and so on, and having to substitute for the U.S.
There are three parts to your question. First and foremost, in terms of the financial means, with the current American administration and other G7 countries, we have just signed off on a $50 billion loan, which will be given to Ukraine. And that is going to be paid for by the Russians, all of the Russian assets that we have seized. So it's not by America, by Europe, the Russians are going to pay for it. So this is our first response to the aggression. The second one that I wanted to mention is 80% of military supplies from Europe actually come from outside the European Union. So we are heavily dependent on countries outside of the Union, and it is an intolerable situation. We cannot last, which is why for the past 7 years, since 2017, we've been calling on the French defense industry to grow and develop, and that is why currently when France, Germany, Poland or other European countries have been increasing their public spending in defense, well, we need to turn that spending towards European industry, because it is unacceptable for European and for French taxpayers to have, on one side, well, an increase on defense budgeting while we're trying to reduce spending elsewhere.
That's what Trump is going to require from us.
Well, if that were to be the case, we will say it's in their interest, because he said on multiple times that our defense spending are rising, increasing so that Europe can ensure its own security. And we will say that, yes, we agree. But you need to give us the freedom to supply its own industries, because if we don't, then European taxpayers will say no. Because we're cutting the budgets elsewhere just to increase defense funding, and it will not be acceptable.
What about NATO? Last word, there was a third plank.
Well, the third part I wanted to speak about was the supposed abandonment of the Trump administration abandoning Ukraine.
That's the whole issue about Ukraine.
Well, it would be quite a huge decision, because it would be almost signing off on a huge annexation of territory. And that would have huge repercussions in Europe, but also elsewhere, because it would be saying we're the strongest, the most powerful, or the most aggressive. They would be able to invade the neighboring country and take over.
We understand the issue, but that's what he announced in spite of everything.
Well, I think he wants to find some solution or some resolution to this crisis. Now, I also think that he wants to show an open hand to Vladimir Putin, who is actually turning his gaze elsewhere, to North Korea, to further east, with the Russian economy, is also completely asphyxiated with huge inflation, with labor shortages and the like.
Caroline wanted us to talk about NATO. She's right. The Secretary General, Mark Rutte, is coming to see the French president. We know that Trump could once again leave NATO. Is that a serious issue?
The French president has said on numerous occasions, our responsibility, the responsibility that befalls our generation, the generation after the one that founded NATO, it is up to us to create a European pillar within NATO, so that progressively Europeans will take on a bigger share of their own
security effort. But that's still not there. Eastern countries and Baltic countries are very fearful because they might not have the US umbrella sufficiently tomorrow.
Well, on the contrary, they see the existential threat that is brought by Vladimir Putin against Europe, and in particular against Eastern Europe. So partners that we have in the Eastern European and Northern European countries, in the Nordic countries, we see that something has to change. The United States have other strategic priorities other than defending Europe, and therefore it is up to us to push towards the situation that we have been pushing for some years. A defense industry on the rise, increased defense spending, and work much closer between European armies.
That's where we're going, but that's not going to take place overnight.
Well, it has already started. We have started to see a shift in terms of our funding mechanisms within Europe. We are currently discussing in Brussels a program to fund the defense industry in Europe, and that is where we need to continue making headway.
A commissioner on industry, Stéphane Séjourné, who is about to be go through his hearings. There's another country that rejoices for Trump. Orban, the ultra-nationalist, he said that's his friend. He was never in favor of Ukraine. Is he going to push for pulling back from Ukraine? Will he become a Trump whisperer?
Well, I don't know if Viktor Orban can demand anything. Many decisions that require people to import in Brussels don't require a unanimous decision, but a majority decision. So what we see is that the situation is quite serious. What is happening on the Ukrainian border is that the very future of Europe is under threat. Look at what people are saying in Romania nowadays. If we were to abandon the Ukrainians, then it is security across the entire continent which would become under threat. And it is that deeply held belief which is widely shared by 26 nations in Europe. I wouldn't dare say that it is Viktor Orban's view of the world, but this is something which is going to change.
Viktor Orban, is he loyal with European partners?
Viktor Orban currently has the responsibility of presiding over the European Council. On Thursday and Friday of last week, he organized a number of meetings with the European political community, with 700 million citizens represented, because it's beyond European Union. There was a council dedicated to competitivity. So what I see with that is that Viktor Orban is ready to step up to the plate and take on certain responsibilities. And the day after the competitive mission,
remember that you went to Georgia after the elections to congratulate the new pro-Russian leader.
Well, I remember just after taking on his new position, headed out to Russia, to China, without necessarily having consulted people before. Well, no. So the country who presides over the European Union Council for 6 months must always ensure that they can bring together all 26 nations to make sure that when they travel and when they speak, it's on behalf of all.
That's not necessarily what he's doing.
I have noticed that on certain occasions that he has not consulted prior to a trip.
This week you went to several places. I mentioned a number of them. Will you soon go to sub-Saharan Africa?
Yes, and before the end of the month, I will be heading to Addis Ababa for a meeting between France and the African Union. It will be an opportunity to restate our ambition for France in Africa to see reform of multilateral and international organizations, predominantly the UN Security Council, so that Africa will have better representation, for these institutions to be more legitimate, and for decisions, when they're made, for those decisions to be heard and embraced around the world.
Better representation, does that mean a post within a permanent seat within the Security Council?
What we defend is the idea of having 2 permanent seats for African countries.
France has had to withdraw from several Sahel countries trying to fight terrorism. Don't you feel that French influence is being rejected by the African continent?
France chose to change its relationship with African nations.
Selected, or was it under constraint?
No, we chose. France chose to change its relationship with African nations, to have a relationship that was looking to the future, one built upon complementarity, upon mutual interests, one which is achieved through ever closer ties between countries and with their governing bodies, but also with civil society. society with the economic world, again, be it in Africa or in France and Europe, to create more ties, because we have a very large African diaspora in Africa, which is a major contributor to the economy and the culture of Europe and European nations. So this transformation is something that we've started to implement, and we will continue to push through and expand. We can already see the early effects of that, so that's why we're encouraged to continue down that path.
You know that the next December, the Tiroy massacre in Senegal, that's its 75th anniversary. Decades, lots of Senegalese were killed. Will France be invited?
So France will be there.
In what way?
Well, I'm not yet sure who or at what level we would be there.
You will be in Africa. Could it be you?
Well, I can't yet confirm exactly how France will be represented, but we will have French representation because it is a major event.
You were invited by the Senegalese authorities.
And as I said, it's important in terms of creating bonds between France and African nations, and a major part of that is looking back at our past.
That's the whole issue. Technically, was France invited by the Senegalese authorities?
Again, I cannot yet answer that question.
You don't have an answer yet.
C'est vrai que l'Union européenne, vous êtes aussi ministre de l'Europe.
You're also Minister for Europe. The EU has relations with Africa. There's an increasing influence of China and Russia in Africa. There were major strategic agreements, including and putting the emphasis on migrations. At the end of the day, we believe that our final goal is to subcontract the management of migrants and asylum seekers by externalizing those to African countries with bilateral relations. Isn't that shrinking the whole thing to focus on migration in our relationship with Africa? Is that the correct way of setting the issue?
In no way is our relationship with Africa solely defined by notions of migration and immigration. When we think of immigration and mobility, the fundamental question of undocumented migration, it is an issue that we're working on with our African partners because they too are subject to that. But in terms of exchanges, there is an exchange of talent, of skills, of people between the African continent, between France. And that is another major part of the book on migration. It is just one chapter. Illegal migration is just one chapter. It's a small chapter. So that's why we're focusing on the entire book of migration. We're looking at complementarity between our countries, between our continents, because we can do so much in terms of civil society, the cultural sector, civil society, in fact, which is also very present in France. And we want to work closely with everything that they are doing to rebuild a relationship. I think it would be too oversimplistic, and it would be missing the point if we were to say our relationship with an African nation is just an issue of migration.
Just have 1 minute left. COP29 opened yesterday in Azerbaijan. Relations between France and Azerbaijan are very tense. Azerbaijan captured 3 Frenchmen and is undergoing an action against France in overseas territories.
Well, here you're talking about the COP, and we'll be celebrating the 10 years of the Paris Agreement. In a few years, we'll be celebrating the Paris Agreement, which is a huge milestone. Well, in Baku, we have sent out negotiators who are currently working on, hopefully, coming to a number of points which we can all agree upon. In particular, the carbon quota market. We need to be very mindful of that because this is a COP summit drawing people from civil society, and we are very mindful of making sure that their attendance will not pose a security threat.
With the Frenchman present there?
We're being very careful of the situation and monitoring it closely.
11th and 12th of November, Peace Forum in Paris, multilateralism, the working global order, that's still topical. Those calls for ceasefires were not answered. So what are you going to do?
Multilateralism will survive as long as we can reform it, and that is what France is pushing for. We want a Security Council which will be more representative of the emerging countries, African nations. We need financial institutions as well, which will enable countries from the global south to not have to choose between, on one hand, the fight for economic sovereignty, and on the other hand, the fight for the climate. And we need to ensure that those decisions will be respected in all aspects. So this is what we are doing from the French point of view. This is what the Prime Minister has asked me to do, and I determined to do it with a steely
Thank you very much
determination.
For coming here today, Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs for France, and thank you for following us on RFI and France 24. Please stay with us. We are still looking at topical issues.